you guys, that would be my. Oh, okay, I would like.
I did start. Oh, you told us. Yeah.
They just won't jump. I've called 6 times.
Oh, it's already. Maybe.
Oh, that's cool. So they give you a deal. Yeah. That's probably just, this is down line, I bet you. Yeah. I'm Steve. Let's go. Come on there. What's the other one? Oh, I remember. Oh, it's good.
So does my, is the microphone on?
Yeah.
You can hear it right there?
Let me hit your button here to start the timer.
So is the microphone on? I don't hear myself.
Yeah, should be.
1, 2, 3, 4. I don't hear myself.
Looks like they're clearing it up over there pretty good.
Hello, everybody. Okay, I can hear myself now. So I guess we're talking.
That's why
Okay, hello, everyone today. Greetings.
Okay, everybody, 10 o'clock. So 10:02 already. One quick announcement. So we'd advertised we were going to give away a 6-meter Yagi with the donor has decided to keep it. So my apologies. So we have Rob Sherwood up here in front, NC0B, and I introduced him a little bit earlier, but I'm going to let him jump right into his presentation. Thanks, Rob.
All right, thank you. Well, a lot's changed in 10 years. So if you're looking for a new rig, this is the place to be. And I'll talk a little bit about the ARRL Clean Signal Initiative, and then some subjective comments on a bunch of rigs. Well, if it would switch, that'd be nice. Yep, there we go. Okay, so choosing a new rig today is subjective and complex because there's so many good choices. You can't go wrong. And what do you need for your typical day? Mainly if you're sideman rag chewing and FTH, you probably don't need a $4,000 radio. But consider your antenna. Of course, you may be in an HOA, and we're going to hear about that today. Or maybe someone in the family says any antenna you want as long as it's invisible. So you got to deal with whatever reality is. I consider location, antenna, operator skill, and then the radio model last, just simply because there's so many good choices today. So what has changed in 10 years? Well, I do lab testing. If you've ever been to my website, there's about 150 radios on there back from the 70s to today. So they're amazing quality today. But the user interface is all over the map. So if you're going to buy a new rig, if at all possible, sit down in front of it. Of course, the things that go through distribution, you go to HRO. If it's Flex or Elecraft, they don't go through distribution. So maybe you've got a friend that you can sit down in front of the radio. Computer operated or not, I consider everything an SDR. That's just sort of semantics, but there's software in everything today. So is your standalone radio like a 7300, or is it run like a Flex? Does it have a big LCD screen or a small one? I find the small one, like in a 7300, okay, but other people like a monitor that are this big. That's up to you. Does it use knobs or touch screen or a mouse, whatever? And the menus are really important, because if you have to go into a menu to do something that you're going to do on a daily, several times in a contest, that's kind of a problem. And is a band scope and a waterfall important to you? I know in the CQ Worldwide last weekend, I'm using the waterfall to find stations. I was working 10 meters only. we had 900 kilohertz of signals on sideband. So I don't know what I would have done without a waterfall and a band scope. So how old's your current rig? If it's 10 years or older, this is a new experience. What do we have today? Superhet, of course, that's been around forever. Hybrid superhet simply added a direct sampling scope. There's direct sampling, of course, and we'll talk about some examples there. And then Yaesu is using IF sampling. So instead of the sampling being at the antenna, in effect, it's to the IF. And that does have an advantage in certain cases. Only Kenwood doesn't have a direct sampling something. So does the architecture matter? Most of the time does not, unless you're in a super terrible RF environment. A superhet has a roofing filter between, let's say, 5 megahertz and 70 megahertz. The hybrid superhet just added the direct sampling scope, and the direct sampling scopes are astounding. And the IF sampling, the analog, the digital converter chip is at the IF, like 9 megahertz. Could be any IF, but that's what it is today. And of course, the pure direct sampling have no roofing filters at all, just by definition. So if you've got a ham down the street, let's say 20 blocks away, and he's 70 over 9, in that case, a radio with a roofing filter, whatever it is, can be an advantage from, in effect, kind of a blocking standpoint or overloading the ADC chip. So here's some examples of superhet. There aren't that many anymore. Like the TS590SG, still a current rig. It's been out for at least 10 years. The IC7100, maybe you've seen that at HRO, is sort of a two-piece device. Really, there's only one, what I'll call a hybrid superhet, the TS890S. I ran one for 3 years. Very nice radio. But now we've got this IF direct sampling, or IF sampling, from the FTDX 101D, the MP, or the FTDX 10, which is a bargain. Lots of direct sampling, the K4D, the 7610, the 7300 Flex, and of course this FT710. So lots of direct sampling now. It's probably cheaper to produce it than all these mixers and all that stuff. In any case, in whatever the sampling is, if it has an ADC chip, it's in the RF path. But only IF sampling has a roofing filter, if that's important. Most of us probably not. But if you got that ham that's really close, consider it. So you can learn a lot by looking at the receiver settings. I'll show a couple of those. What you see on a direct sampling scope, whether it's a simple 7300 or a higher end radio, this is reality. So if a guy's splattering, you can see it. And the guy can't get away with saying he's overloading your receiver. That scope shows you reality, whether it's CW key clicks, splatter on sideband, so it's real. I want to consider preamps and attenuators tools. You don't want to use them all the time. And I'll talk a little bit about when to use them and when not. And we'll look at some 10 meter and 160 meter contest examples. So this was clear back in 2018, bottom of the sunspot cycle. As you can see, the signals are pretty weak, but there were more than 20 stations in 10 kilohertz. This happened to be the Kenwood. Over on the right, upper right, preamps on 10 meters, shouldn't be a surprise. The lower right, audio peak filter, reduces noise. I don't use it, increase the selectivity, because that's all done in DSP, but you can. But I use it to shave off some noise. So you can see plenty of stations to work, but they were pretty darn weak. The week before was the 160 contest. Well, looking, you've got over 30 stations here in 10 kilohertz. And over on the left, no preamp, I've got the attenuator on. Band noise on 160 is about 30 dB higher than on 10. Radios all have to be sensitive enough for 10, and now, of course, 6 meters. So when you're on 160 or 80 or 40, you've got too much sensitivity in general. So consider the attenuator. You're not going to lose the signal. It's just you don't need that kind of sensitivity. One thing that I happened to catch here that just came along for free, there's a station on the left, and look at the shape of it on the band scope where it says key clicks 5X. And then the waterfall, look how wide that is. Look over on the right where it says clean. That signal is only 3 dB weaker. Yet look how narrow it is on this band scope, and the waterfall is tiny. Back on the left, there's a little tiny signal trying to peek through the guy's key clicks. You can see a little blip there on the band scope, and you can even see the blips in the waterfall. So this is not the way you want your signal to work, and this is showing your direct sampling band scope is showing the reality. Now, I can't go into this in great detail, but one year, the next year actually, I didn't have anything new to test. So I compared a 7300 to a TS990S. Well, the 7300 only has one 20 dB attenuator. Of course, it's also got an RF gain. I said, well, let's just compare the two for this whole contest. I ran the 18 dB attenuator on the Kenwood, the 20 on the ICOM. I'd never run that much on 160 before. I loved it because band noise was almost out of the picture. Occasionally, I'd have to turn the volume control up, but it was just nice. So consider attenuation, play with it. So when do you need a preamp? This is called antenna noise gain. On the upper bands, make your dummy load any kind of termination. It doesn't have to be a 100-watt dummy load, but provide access to a 50 ohm termination some way with an antenna switch or a spare port on your transceiver. If you go between your dummy load and your antenna, if you can barely hear the band noise come up, then add a preamp. But if it's coming up a lot, and a lot is like 10 dB or something, then keep the preamp off. This last weekend with CQ Worldwide SSB, I worked 630 stations, mostly S&P, and I hardly ran the preamp 5% of the time. The signals were just strong, and 28.3 to 29.2, can you believe that? Solid signals. So just use it if you need it, but if you don't need it, no, don't do it. On the low bands, you're not going to run the preamp. And so there's no point on band noise running your AGC. So throw in some attenuation, RF gain. Some of the rigs, like the K4 or the Flex, have a threshold, a slider. So just move it around so that the band noise isn't running the AGC. There's just no point in that. Now here's a picture where we saw what you could see on terrible key clicks on the band scope. So this is a screen capture here from the W0IVJ and Boulder took of sideband to see pre-distortion. Now, how many people know what pure signal is from Apache, or just the term pre-distortion? Does this mean something? This is a way to clean up our sideband signals. Right now, we've only got 2 companies providing it. I think in the future, we'll have 3 or 4. So if we look at this screen capture, the signal on the top of the waterfall here was an Apache 200D. That's about 9-year-old radio running Warren Pratt's pure signal. And also with the Apache product, it's very easy to put the amplifier, solid state LDMOS amp or whatever, in the correction loop. In pure signal or pre-distortion, it looks at the signal and says, okay, this isn't quite right. So I'm going to look at any nonlinearity and kind of invert it, feed it back in, out of phase, phase and amplitude both, and cancel out distortion. So you can see here, this is a fairly strong signal, about 30/9, 75 meters. And the signal on top of the waterfall is virtually a pure rectangle. You can see just a tiny little bit of splatter on the right-hand side, just a little blip here and there. And you can also see some sort of a power supply switching birdie running around there that is wobbling in frequency. Now the signal at the bottom of this waterfall, well, I have to admit that was me with a TS890S, a perfectly good rig, but no pre-distortion, driving an Alpha 89. Well, look how wide that is. Now, admittedly, there was a good signal-to-noise ratio. If it's only 20 dB, for instance, you wouldn't see all this. But this was on 75, and the signal was strong and the band noise was low. So look how wide, almost a 3-to-1 difference at, let's say minus 50 dB. And that pre-distortion just cleans it up. Now, here's the other case where was me that was looking good. The top one is the ICOM 7610, which designed like 8-9 years ago, but they knew they were going to offer pre-distortion. So at Thanksgiving last year, they shipped a firmware update that allowed pre-distortion on a 7610. Unfortunately, we don't know how to include that with a third-party amplifier, but this was with a tube amp, an ACOM 1000. And if you look at my signal on the waterfall there on the top, it's just a rectangle with just a tiny little bit of blip here and there on the right. Down below, this was the Flex flagship at the time, the Flex 6600M, driving the Power Genius XL W5AP. So again, look at the splatter difference. It's about 3 times as wide, let's say at -50, as with the pre-distortion. So if everybody could be running pre-distortion, think how less splatter there'd be on the bands. But we got to share the bands. So this is important. Now look at the top, that's the band scope. The Flex just started to talk again when this picture was taken. And you can see the band scope shows the same type of thing. You know, you got the main signal, and then all of a sudden all this noise, you know, it's spreading out over the frequency there, you know, follows what we're seeing with the waterfall. So there's nothing funny going on here. So is it time for a new rig in your shack? There's so many choices, particularly if you're a contester, a DXer, or DXpeditions, you may want to have an improvement. But I'd again say, if you're just rag chewing, signals are 20/9, or you're running an FT8, and everybody seems to run at least 100 watts on FT8 these days, if not more. So you may not need anything, but of course, who doesn't want a new rig? One nice thing with the more current rigs is built-in sound card makes it easy to do these digital modes without having to have a separate device. This is my website if you've ever been there. This is the top 25 rigs, not the first 25 on the list because there's some duplicates. The K3 came out, and then the K3S came out. And so there's second samples. Some of the direct sampling radios, there's some variation because each ADC chip is slightly different. So the numbers are slightly different too. So there's second samples. So this is just the top 25 individual models. 20 years ago, you couldn't buy a 100 dB radio. Well, that's right in the middle now. Do we need a 110 dB radio? Probably not, but they're there. And clear down, you can enjoy running any of these 25. Of these 25, I've run 20 of these models at my contest station for at least one major contest, if not more. So hands-on, they all will work. So whatever fits your budget and your fancy, small, large, whatever, they're just amazing today. But just realize that what we have today compared to 20 years ago is just night and day. There's my lab. You probably don't want all that in your place, but but you know, I'm sort of a techie nerd, and I can probably measure about anything. So how are you going to select a new radio? I would say look at the top 25 and go from there, because all the brands are there. So that'd be a good start. And if you're married to a brand, say you've been a Yaesu owner for the last 50 years and you want to stay with Yaesu, every of the major 6 OEMs, they've got a good radio. So you can stay with your brand or not. I've been around the horn on several. The price range is all over the map from like $1,000 brand new to $12,000 or more. I did own one of the $10,000 radios for about 5 months and said, this was nuts. For me, it didn't make sense, but whatever fits your budget. The biggest difference I'm finding today is the ergonomics, you know, where all the knobs and buttons are, the user interface. It's very important for efficient operation. Now, if you're just drag chewing, you maybe don't care that much, but if I'm in a contest and I want to change the AGC and want to change the bandwidth and want to do all these adjustments on the fly, the user interface is really important. Noise mitigation. How many people live out in the country where there's no noise? Okay, we at least got 2, and I'm included. So maybe we got 4 or 5. But for the most part, the average ham's in an urban environment, and noise is a big deal. So noise mitigation, how good is noise blanking and noise reduction? This is sort of it's improving, but it's not improving as fast as I think we'd like. This is something that's going to kind of be surprise, I imagine, for most of you. Every analog to digital converter chip is too noisy without a preamp. Now, what an individual equipment manufacturer decides to be the default gain is all over the map. So here's 7 of the popular direct sampling rigs. If we look over at the right-hand column, they're all about 100 dB. You would never know whether it's 99 or 101 or 97. They're just fantastic. But look at the noise floor, kind of consider it sensitivity. Noise floor is measured in CW bandwidth if you look at your QST reviews or on my website. But with no preamp, no attenuator, there's a 22 dB difference in the noise floor from brand to brand. Now, none of those are wrong. That's just a decision by the OEM. That's what they want with no preamp turned on. So if you've got a flex, at least in my quiet QTH, you're probably going to need a preamp, maybe even on 20 meters, where just as I said, on 10 meters last weekend, I didn't even run the preamp maybe 5% of the time. But there's plenty of preamp, so it isn't a problem. It's just different. You look at the K4, that's kind of in the middle. It's you would never probably need a preamp on 20 meters there, like with the Flex. But now look at the 7300 or the 7610, a lot more sensitive, but too sensitive on the low bands. So you're going to want to run attenuation on 40 meters at night, or certainly 80 or 160. I pretty much run 6 during a rag chew on 40 meters. So there's no point in having sensitivity to burn on the low bands if your radio works that way, but the Flex doesn't, and even the K4 is sort of there in the middle. So current rig offerings, this is going to be all subjective. This is not my lab stuff that you would see in that list and in that crazy lab of mine. It's like using these on the air from either at least a contest or more. And they would be CW contests, sideband contests. I don't do really, I do some digital, but not in contests. And I'll look at the operating positions and how I actually do this comparison. Now, this is my operating position number 1. I have 3. Now, I don't run multi-multi, but to change bands, sometimes I change chairs. Or if I'm comparing radios, I'll run one for a while and go another one. So this is my normal setup. You can see I've got 6 rotors because I've got 6 towers, so, kind of crazy. When I was evaluating the FTDX10 and the FT710, I had them for 3 months, fourth quarter, and did everything from rag chewing, contesting, you name it. So here is what it was set up. So the fourth quarter of 2022, there's the FTDX10 in place of the ICOM. Everything else is the same. There is the FT710 on operating position 2, where there would normally be an ICOM, but for 3 months, I just ran Yaesu. And that was kind of an eye-opener to really see how do these two compare, and how do the user interfaces compare. So there's my little antenna farm out on Highway 14. There's 9 HF Yagis, all monoband. So I've got 2 Yagis on 20, 2 Yagis on 15, 2 Yagis on 10. So this past weekend, I did a 10-meter only, CQ Worldwide. The 3-element beam was pointed to the Caribbean. The 5-element beam was pointed to Europe or JA or whatever. And I just flip a switch to go in a different direction. It just really works out well. This was a dream to come true. I started building the station 17 years ago. I'm too old now at 77 to climb, but at least at 60, I could climb all day. Not as many as you'd think. Friends that in the area will come out because they know me, but it's a rare. I mean, it's a rare that someone just knocks on the door. Yeah, that knock on the door is a good idea. Okay, so we're going to look at some at the Flex. Flex has been really busy with military contracts. I think they're still doing some of that. So some of the trickle-down ideas haven't really propagated yet, but they've spent a lot of time in the last 5 years on remote, which you're probably aware of, and on contesting. Not much going on in DSP improvements, though, out of Flex. One thing that I don't like is no schematics, no service manual. Now, I don't fix service mount radios, but I still want to look at the schematics and see what's going on. And in one case, the Yaesu took a EMP hit, and my friend Ken N0QO was able to fix it. So you need this information. Unfortunately, I can't get it from Flex. The new 8000 series has just started to ship. It replaces the 6000 series, mainly because of chips go out of production or they get too expensive, and there are some new capabilities. However, this is all software that will come down the road. We're talking to Mark back there. Pre-distortion is not available yet. This interesting way to have multiple FT8 channels on at the same time, not available yet. So if you have a new 8000, it will be no different than the 6000 now, but there'll be new stuff coming out, but over time. So the question is, what does over time mean? Probably longer than you like. The Maestro C, which replaced the A and the B, they've been shipping now for a month or so, maybe two. And I imagine there's like a few dozen 8000s out there, maybe 50, I don't know. Apache, it's made in Australia, and they probably have the best noise mitigation, noise blanking, noise reduction. It's all open source software. The OEM writes no software. Warren Pratt, NR0V, who now lives in Loveland, Colorado, I probably see him once a month. He's written all this DSP software, including the pre-distortion called Pure Signal. And right now we've just got Apache and ICOM with pre-distortion, as you saw. It's a fiddler's delight, but if you're just got your moved from a tech to a general or even higher, I do not recommend this is your first HF radio. It's got too many things you don't know what they do. You go into these menus and do I click on this or click on that? I don't know. So when you're starting out at HF, if this is where you are in your amateur progression, get a standalone radio, 100 watts. Don't start with QRP, and don't start with a computer-controlled one for your first radio. After that, whatever. There's not a lot of documentation on some of the things on the Apache, and but it is open source, and things happen fast in open source. The 7300, well, I called it a game changer, not because it was the best radio ever made, but it was the first direct sampling radio that had knobs. You plugged it in and it worked. You didn't have to download software. And they've sold over 100,000 of them. I mean, you can't get on the air today and talk for let's say 2 hours and not talk to a 7300. How many people own a 7300? Yeah, it's just really popular. It works a lot like the more expensive 7610. The ergonomics I like. That's, of course, subjective. One thing, the ICOM user interface across the 4 different versions of 7300, 7610, 9700 is a VHF, UHF, and the little portable 705. They all work about the same. If you can run one, you can run them all. One thing that is important to me, like in this contest last weekend, is I'll have a span of whatever. In this case, it was 50 kilohertz, but then on 160, it was like 10. When I work all the stations, I'm mostly an S&P operator, unless I'm running JAs. So I work all the stations in the whatever span I chose. And I'm at the end of it, I'm going usually left to right. Well, then when I tune the next signal, I get a whole new span. And so I don't have to recenter it. But some of the radios, like the Yaesus, don't ever recenter. You got to do it manually. So that's just what works for me. So the scrolling feature is really important so that the waterfall doesn't smear. The firmware is stable. We don't have a lot of bugs, so that's an advantage. But then some of the other brands come out with new features. Maybe they're bug-free, maybe they're not. Now the 7300, no audio peak filter on CW, so that's missing. But it's there. They said an entry-level radio. I don't consider it an entry-level radio. I run about 8 contests with it. It's a darn good radio. Comments on the FT710. It's their first direct sampling radio out of Yaesu. They don't talk about, they give a block diagram and they just sort of says, here's our DSP. But they've got an ADC chip that has 2 of them in one chip they're feeding them in. Are they in quadrature? Are they in phase? I don't know. They don't say. But it has a little bit better numbers than the 7300, for instance. But it came out 7 years later. So the price ranges you can see there. If you want the 710 with the speaker, it's $100 more. So consider that. I put it on the right. If you put it on the left, it blocks the SD card. So like put it on the right. I like it panned all the way to the right and not mixing the internal speaker and the external speaker. To me, it sounds funny. That's up to you. The interface, I would say the interface could be better. The 3D interface, I think, is a waste of time. What's a waterfall? It's a history of what's been going on for the last length of time, 30 seconds, a minute. With the 3D, you send one dit, or you go, hello, it wipes it out. But what good is the waterfall if it wipes out the history? But so just use the 2D, which originally didn't work right, but they fixed it. So I use this in CQ Worldwide CW, it's ARRL 160, 10 meters. So I really rang it out plus general operating. The FTDX10, the numbers on all three of the new current radios, well, 4 really, are tremendous. I think the user interface could be better, but that's subjective. The IF sampling is an advantage if you've got really strong signals like 60/9, 70/9. I don't see those out in the country. The 710 and the 10 has an audio peak filter. The 7300 does not. Again, I used a bunch of contests, including the Stu Perry. By the time that Stu Perry came along in December, I just ran the 10 because it was easier to adjust the CW bandwidth, the CW shift with a knob, dual concentric knobs. With the 710, kind of more clumsy. Again, that's subjective. So comparing the two Yaesus, it's like they were made by two different companies. Adjusting the bandwidth is easy on the 10, not so much on the 710. The volume control on the 10 is on the left. If you're right-handed, you tend to bump the VFO. The 710 came out, they moved the volume control to the right. But so it's just different, but you can get used to anything. And when I did run the 10 in that Stu Perry contest, I just was careful not to bump the VFO. The 590 series has been around a long time. The SG has been out for 10 years. That's forever in the radio world. It's a good performer. Used to be the best bang for the buck. Doesn't have a scope, but you can add it with a dongle like a SDR Play or even the Elecraft P3 available in the used market because you don't need a P3 with a K4. You can hook a P3 up to about anything. I hooked it up to a Drake R4C. Program right in for the IF of the R4C. Amazing. The 590S goes back another 4 years. If you're budget constrained, look at the used market. The 7300 crashed the used market. It's only $1,000. So a lot of stuff now is, $500 to $700. The user interface is pretty simple. And I ran the S and the SG along with the 10 Tech Eagle in contest back then. Will Kenwood come out with a new rig? Well, I don't think they are this year. The SG's been out for 10. I really enjoyed the 890S. It's a great little radio. That was sort of medium-sized radio. The TS2000 was what we call DC light radio, but it got discontinued. Supposedly there was going to be a replacement that would be something to compete with the 7300 and compete with the 9700. HF versus VHF, UHF, it didn't happen. So I don't know if we're going to see a new Kenwood right now. They are just they brought out their new walkie-talkie. I think it's about $650. Summits and parks on the air. We'll call it 10 watts in a battery. The ICOM 705, 160 through 70 centimeters, all in one little box. Sideband, CW, FM, digital, FT8 or whatever mode, with a laptop, of course. It's $1,350. There is a companion tuner, single wire type of tuner. So if you were out on a park bench with a 23-foot piece of wire thrown up into a tree and a radio on the ground, you can work 40 meters through 6 meters with the punch of a button, tunes up right away, like within seconds. New Year's Day, 2023, there was a guy with a 705 on one of the mountaintops. S9, he was like in the shack. He was just perfect. And he had a little 3-element Yagi on 2 meters. There's what it looks like. It even got a little speaker on the above the tuning knob. It's 2.4 pounds. The 705 has lots of features I didn't use. Same interface, and used it in 2020 in 160 meters and 10 meters. There's a new Yaesu announced. I don't know much about it. Not shipping yet. Don't know what the cost is. It will compete with the 705. So we got competition's good for all of us. It replaces the 817 and the 818. 5 or 6 watts with the internal battery, 10 watts with an external supply. Don't know what it's going to cost. It's got an optional tuner. Don't know much about that. It has an optional cooling fan. Why do you need a cooling fan with a 5 or 10 watt rig? I don't get it, but that's available. Apparently for FT8, I don't know. The K4, well, it was announced 5.5 years ago. It didn't start shipping for a couple of years, but they've made some big strides in the last 2.5 years on firmware and all that. They have remote K4 to K4. The only trouble is you need about $14,000 to do that. But they're going to come out with some other software too, so you don't need 2 K4s. They announced a price increase that was going to occur in October. Hasn't happened yet. It'd probably be pretty close to $7,000, but they are running some specials with some extra accessories. No general coverage yet, no pre-distortion, and no schematics. To compare the 710 to the 7300, I get this all the time quickly. No noisy relays in the 710. Does have the audio peak filter missing in the 7300. 2 receivers, of course. More physical buttons and larger LCD screen. 2 antenna ports, an RX port. I just put a beverage up a year ago, so that type of idea. It does have a port for an external monitor. I don't do that, but if you want to monitor this big, great. The fan is much quieter. Buy their extra tuning knob to use on the sub receiver. I don't use a sub receiver much until the DXpeditions come along, and I use it every time. When firmware 1.42 came out, that's the final version, but the 1.4 came out Thanksgiving Day a year ago. The 7760 was hinted at Dayton. It was shown at Tokyo. I don't quite understand the market, but it's a 200 watt rig. So there, a lot of Japanese just runs barefoot with 200 watts. So maybe it'll be popular. It's kind of pricey. It's about twice the price of a 7610. The MP is cheaper, and the 990, I think, is in limited life, but price is stratosphere. The lab numbers, of course, I haven't tested it yet, but just looking at the block diagram and the specs, I don't see much difference between the 7610 and the 7760. It weighs twice as much, but it does have a remote head. Not quite sure what that's all about. So, important things to consider. If you're operating long time, like contests or DXpeditions, fatigue is an issue. So you want the receiver not to have, cruddy audio. AGC does dumb things. Noise reduction and noise blanking. You might pick a radio just because it's better for you with your noise in town. Flex may be the best for remote, and Apache's got the pure signal, really the best noise mitigation I've ever heard. So those are the options. Barefoot, the digital pre-distortion on the ICOM works really well, particularly with tube amps that are not in the loop. So the signals you saw there in those pictures were, in my case, with an amp. But if it was a solid state amp, it's going to need to be in the loop. And right now, you can only do that with the PW2. So consider other factors. Don't buy a radio on one number. I mean, I sort of started this in the 70s and 80s because there were big differences between the dynamic ranges. Now, if you got a 90 dB radio or 100 dB radio or 110, don't pick it on just that number. Look at the big picture. Ergonomics can be frustrating. The speech processor didn't work in the K4 initially. The CW bandwidths were screwed up initially, but that's all been fixed. Do you want a standalone radio? That's what I happen to use, but then all the people running computer-controlled radios, they work. It's up to you. Warranty service can be a big deal. I know the Kenwood had a very good repair station in Virginia, and it was shut down. You had to go to California. They were terrible. They eventually got fired, and now there's a company out of New York for Kenwood, and that's working out well. What about parts? Well, what about how many K3 owners do we have here? Gee, not too many. So the question will be, can you get a K3 fixed down the road? But then there's 10,000 out there. So if you had to buy one for parts, probably not a big deal. The bottom line, do you enjoy using your radio? Hopefully you do. That's the thing. If you say, this radio is hard to use, try something else, because you've got all these choices. Your club has a PDF of this, and I guess it's going to be on your website too. And Rob at NC0B.com is available for any type of questions later. Do we have any questions? We got like 5 minutes. Way at the back.
That's challenging to measure.
Yes.
How that works in your lab.
Okay, the question is testing in my lab. The problem is you have to have phenomenal isolation between the two signal sources. Otherwise, they can cross-modulate and make their own interference. So I know I can measure 110 dB radios if there ever was 120. I don't know. I don't think we need a 120 dB radio, but it is a challenge. Also, the phase noise of your signal generators are critical. What I used in the 70s, when I started testing radios in 1975, with equipment that you couldn't measure current stuff with. So every 10 years, I had to upgrade the lab. So the phase noise has to be low and the isolation has to be tremendous. There's buffer amps and attenuators and combiners and all this stuff. So it's a chore to keep up with what you're trying to test. You don't want to be testing your equipment. You want to be testing the radio. Any other questions? Yes.
Really, well, the radio. I got a gas 1870.
Okay.
And I was using the automatic, antenna adjust thing. He started turning on my light. That's my bed. What would cause that? It's one of those lamps that you can't touch.
Oh yeah, well he's asking about the radio while it's tuning and all that affecting in this case the touch lamp. Throw your touch lamp away. It makes interference all over the band. I had one, well, about 20 years ago, and when we moved out in the country, it got lost somehow. So it's touch lamp, but it's RF sensitive. So that's just what is. Any other? Yes.
You had one chart with noise floor.
Well, there's like 11 different categories. So the noise floor happens to be on the left, and there's also an explanation of all the categories. So what's really the question?
Modern versus like an old classic R390.
Okay, well, you can obviously compare any current radio with an R390, and sensitivity or noise floor is not a problem. A 75A4 was really too sensitive. Your R390 is just about the same as a Drake R4C or a Kenwood or whatever. For most everyone, the noise of your urban environment is the limitation. But if you are out in the country like I am, it's still not an issue. I can't imagine, I've done so many A/B comparisons that I don't think I can think of a case with a normal radio that isn't broken, that I can hear a signal in one case and I can't hear it in the other. It's just not the case. But of course, selectivity can be a big deal. When I was running CQ Worldwide, I was going between 2.4 and 2.1, depending on the QRM. So I would say good filtering is more of an issue than the sensitivity. All right, gentlemen.
You use a separate antenna for receiving?
I can use my beverage on the 80 or 160. The question was, do I use a separate antenna? Generally, no. I've tried diversity, but I haven't found on 20 meters it made much difference. Other people say it's tremendous. But that's something that the dual receivers can offer. But no, I generally don't use a separate antenna, but I like the ability to switch directions at the click of a switch. That's a luxury most of us don't have. All right, gentlemen. Oh, who had a question? Okay, sorry. Yeah, hi, Rob.
Can you
mentioned the APF filter.
Yeah, audio
I'm
peak.
familiar with what it is and how you use it.
Okay, it's audio selectivity. And sometimes it's just fixed. I like think with a K3 and a K4, it's like 30 hertz or 50 hertz. To me, that's too narrow. On the ICOM and the Kenwood, you could adjust the bandwidth that you want, like wide, medium, narrow, adjust the gain, because I don't want to switch in the audio peak filter and have to turn the volume up. That was the problem with the ICOM 7700 when it first shipped. It had a loss in audio, even though it had narrowed the selectivity. So it's just an audio filter. And so I would say, 150 hertz bandwidth or 200 hertz. If you want 50, fine, but I find you tend to lose the signal if it's too narrow. So it reduces noise. Some people use it for better selectivity. That's up to you.
Just for CW mostly?
Yeah, that's just CW only. Yeah, it's just the CW audio filter. All right.
You did get one more.
Oh, yes.
That time.
Recommend a good first starter base antenna that I don't get thrown out the house spending that much money for multi-bands.
Okay. Do you have an HOA or can you put an antenna up? Okay. Well, start with a dipole, my goodness, and get it as high as possible and as far away from the house as possible. You've got noise generators in your house, your washing machine, your dishwasher, your iPhone charger, whatever. So you want your antenna to be far away. Of course, you don't want it next to your neighbor's house either. So you have to trade off there, but keep it simple. Now, to me, directivity is it. So if you can put up a 3-element tri-bander, for instance, directivity would be more important than the gain. I would say when I'm switching between my monobanders, I'm not saying you should do that, but it's like different bands. I can go between looking at the Caribbean and looking at Europe or looking at JA, and there's like 20 or 30 dB difference. So if you can knock the interference down 20 or 30 dB due to directivity, that's gold. Height, half wave, try to do half wave. 40 meters, that's 65 feet. I have a 40-meter beam, but if you just say, I can't do that, but on 10 meters, it's only, 16 feet. So shoot for a half wave or more.
Because I've got a big piece of land.
Hey, if you got a bunch of land, put up 2 towers. Yeah, right. Well, show a picture of mine and say yours isn't going to be as big. Yes.
So AGC, do you find being able to set the threshold with some of the fancier features on AGC, like with a Flex or a K4, useful versus like a 70 7010 and some of the box radios?
I don't care how you adjust the threshold. You can do it with an attenuator, an RF gain, or the sliders on the K4 or the Apache or the Flex. I just want on the low bands, I don't want band noise running the AGC.
Yeah.
So if you set the AGC like 6 dB above band noise, it's going to make the fatigue a lot less. And then 2% of the time you'll have to turn the volume up. Who cares? I'm not going to be so bloody tired. I was on the air 20 hours CQ Worldwide. Noise is a killer.
All right. Thank you. Awesome presentation as usual. All right. So we've got 10 minutes. I'm going to do a quick giveaway. Just a reminder. Or a update on the Jimmy John's order. So I was